Hello everyone, welcome back. This is fourth in our series on Aboriginal policy in Canada as it relates to FNMI education practices. Today's lecture concerns a number of different things. I want to look with you at the AFN. We haven't really talked about the Assembly of First Nations. We're going to learn who they are today. We're going to talk about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Penner Report, Bill C-31. We've talked a fair bit about that. We're going to do a brief review of that. The Charlottetown Accord, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Kelowna Accord. We're going to talk about the residential schools plan for compensation. We're going to talk about the apology from 2008, Idle No More, Bill C-33, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're running the whole gamut of education, or rather Aboriginal policy in Canada here, and we're looking specifically at these things to decide how do they affect the students who you have in your classroom who are First Nations or Inuit or Métis. How have they affected people in the past? With understanding these things, maybe you can see a little bit about how these particular policies affect education in Canada as well. All right, so let's first look at the Assembly of First Nations. What is the Assembly of First Nations? It came out of the National Indian Brotherhood. It first popped up in 1982. It's a body of leaders in Canada, Aboriginal leaders. The aim of the organization is to protect the rights, treaty obligations, and claims of First Nation citizens in Canada, right? The Assembly of First Nations was founded by a meeting of hundreds of chiefs in Ottawa in 1980. The chiefs declared the Assembly the one and only voice of First Nations in Canada. The AFN replaced the National Indian Brotherhood, NIB, with a new structure based on a common vote of individual First Nation governments. The chiefs outlined their relationships with Canada and with one another in a manifesto entitled The Declaration of First Nations. So historically, Native Canadians have a unique and special relationship with the Crown and the people of Canada because of the treaties and other historical documents. The AFN exists to promote the restoration and enhancement of this relationship and to ensure that it's beneficial to both Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. The Assembly of First Nations is a national Aboriginal lobby organization. So it represents more than 900,000 people living in 634 First Nation communities in cities and towns across the country. The chiefs meet annually to set national policy and direction through resolutions. The national chief is elected every 3 years by the chiefs in assembly, and the membership of the Confederacy consists of chiefs and other regional leaders chosen according to a formula based on the population of each region. The AFN receives most of its operating funds from the Department of Northern Affairs, or Indian Affairs rather. The overall structure of the AFN is based on the Charter of the Assembly of First Nations, which was adopted in 1985. So, that's a little bit of background on them. There are many people have identified certain problems with the AFN. What are these problems? Well, Native women in particular are concerned that the AFN discriminates against them in politics. For instance, the Assembly of First Nations opposed Bill C-31. Now, I did a big long investigation of that with you in an earlier lecture, so you can review that if you have not already listened to it. But Bill C-31, it gave Native women back their status as Indians if they married non-Native men. Additionally, the AFN opposes the application of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to Aboriginal self-government, right? So this is seen by Native women as a real problem because, as you maybe are aware anyway, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, women's groups were really integral in creating that document. Section 15 and Section 28, especially in the Charter. And so Native women, naturally enough, would want the protections afforded to them by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the AFN was just adamantly opposed to that. Moreover, there are extremely high rates of physical and sexual abuse among Native women by Aboriginal men. Many Native women, already worried about the light sentences that sex-offending Native men receive in traditional healing circles, are concerned that self-government would create further inequalities for women on reservations. So you can see there's a tension here, folks, right? On the one hand, Native women, naturally enough, just like anyone else in Canada, would really want and treasure the equality protections under the Charter. But then from the AFN's perspective, the Charter is a colonializing document, right? It's a document that's not a Native Aboriginal document. It's foisted upon them. It's imposed upon them, and any laws that they make or any ideas that they have about self-government then have to be, stamped with the Charter's approval. They have to become Charter compliant, right? So that offends them. They're suspicious of it. They don't trust it. So there are tensions within Native communities on these things, and this is one of the problems that the AFN has to settle. Another major problem is that there are real big schisms in the AFN between radicals and moderates. I don't know what else to call it. It's just, it's like that in most organizations, right? Folks who lean hard, in this case, to the parallelism side of the spectrum, they see any compromise or middle ground positions taken by AFN leadership as selling out. So the Idle No More group, for instance, seems to be particularly vocal in its refusal to compromise with the federal government or to follow AFN leaders who would steer policy more towards the center of the spectrum we've been studying. So there's a rather nasty political cartoon where Sean Atleo is depicted as somehow being a money grubber and a sellout for trying to broker a deal with between the federal government and the AFN chiefs and the First Nations peoples. So lots and lots of disagreement. It's not. The AFN, isn't monolithic in its voice, right? There's lots of schism and turbulence. Okay, so that's the AFN was around. Then we have the 1982 Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms coming in 1982, so 2 years later. Again, we talked about this, how this was brought in under Pierre Trudeau's leadership. What does the 1982 Constitution Act say about Canada's Native people? We've looked at this before. We'll look at it now as a review. The Constitution Act of 1982 increased the power and rights of Aboriginal peoples in Canada. It also expanded who has Native rights, no longer restricting these rights to, quote, treaty Indians, as in Section 91, but also recognizing that such rights belong to Inuit and Métis people as well. Charter of Rights and Freedoms states that specialized Aboriginal rights and freedoms are not affected by the Charter. Okay, so this is one of the things that the AFN was really concerned about, that the Charter could be used to nullify Native rights. I mean, if you think about it, right? Native rights are based on race, ethnicity. It sounds pretty discriminatory, right? So, if there weren't a section like Section 25, then, they could be struck out. So Aboriginal leaders, naturally enough, wanted to make sure that, charter rights and freedoms, whatever, but whatever kind of rights we have based on the treaties and things like this, you can't use this as a means to take those away from us. You see? So here's the section. Section 25, the guarantee of this charter, in this charter of certain rights and freedoms shall not be construed so as to abrogate or derogate from any Aboriginal treaty or other rights or freedoms that pertain to the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, including any rights or freedoms that have been recognized by the Royal Proclamation 1763, we studied that, and any rights and freedoms that now exist by way of land claims agreements. Alright, so those sorts of things are protected under Section 25. Also, Section 35. The 1982 Constitution Act, of which the Charter is a part, enlarges the classes of people. Alright, so we looked at this already, but we'll look at it here too. The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples are hereby recognized and affirmed. 2. In this Act, Aboriginal people include Indian, Inuit, and Métis people. And 3. For greater certainty, treaty rights include rights that now exist by way of land claims, right? And notwithstanding any other provision, the Aboriginal and treaty rights referred to in this subsection are guaranteed equally to male and female persons. So Bill C-31, see? So that is another really important section. So 25 and 35, really significant gains for Aboriginal people in Canada. Problems with the Aboriginal rights provisions in the Charter in 1982 Constitution. Are there problems? Well, Treaty Indians, Inuit, and Métis are all grouped together in the Charter. Some people are concerned that this may mean that the particular or special concerns of Métis and Inuit peoples may be overlooked in favor of the concerns of primarily Indian leaders. In short, there's a danger that Indians will dominate the other two groups, and tensions between the three groups of Aboriginal people may cause problems. So when everybody's lumped together like that, a tendency is that the bigger group overwhelms the other two groups, right? Grouping all native peoples together as Aboriginal people in the Charter also oversimplifies the different needs of Indians, Métis, and Inuit. Métis and Inuit concerns are overshadowed by Indian concerns. This is known as the common treatment syndrome. A good example of how lumping everyone together as Aboriginal people can adversely affect native populations is the concern with self-government. Self-government has been an important idea to reserve-based Indian peoples, but it has little application to urban populations like the Métis. See? Alright, moving rather swiftly through history here. We're going from 1980 to 1982, and now we're in 1983. Keith Penner's report on Native issues. The Penner report was subtitled Report of the Special Committee on Indian Self-Government. The Penner report was the first government document to discuss the meaning of self-government for Canada's Native peoples. Self-government effectively means that virtually the entire range of lawmaking, policy, program delivery, law enforcement, and adjudication powers would be available to an Indian First Nations government within its territory. The Penner report also looked at the representation of Native people in Canadian politics, as well as the significance of Native people finally getting the right to vote in 1960. Prior to that, Aboriginal people lacked any voice in politics. The 1983 Penner report was strongly affected by Quebec separatism, and Native people began to look at the separatist use of language in order to strengthen their own rights and identity claims constitutionally. The 1976 separatist victory of the Parti Québécois in Quebec was made possible by referring to Quebecers as a nation. This victory also taught Canada's Native people to no longer speak about their own Native identity in terms of this or that band, but in terms of nations. By speaking of themselves in terms of nations, Canada's Native people hope to reap some of the same benefits and constitutional power that Quebec had acquired through the use of the term nation. So you can see this is that rhetorical power of the term nation that we looked at in the first lecture at some great length. The Penner Report is the first government document to use the term First Nations to describe Aboriginal people. So it's a significant document. Where's this term First Nations come from? It's first comes out in the Penner Report. That's the first government document where it's used. It may have been used before that among First Nations people to start thinking about, how to garner more power in the Federation. But the first government document where it appears is actually the Penner Report. Due to its new stress on self-government and Aboriginal peoples as nations, the Penner Report becomes the first major example in Aboriginal policy of parallelism. Parallelism is the idea that underlies the two-row wampum concept. That Aboriginal society is not only completely different, but completely separate from the rest of Canadian society, and that both communities run parallel with each other. So, on the assimilationism, parallelism spectrum here, I think you can see how the Penner Report has started to move further over towards parallelism, right? If we might plot the red paper and the Hawthorne Report near the center of the arrow, I would suggest to you that Penner actually moves further towards parallelism than that. So it starts to tilt. What is this notion of Aboriginal self-government that is represented or discussed in the Penner Report? Aboriginal self-government means that virtually the entire range of law-making, policy, program delivery, law enforcement, and adjudication powers will be available to Indian First Nation governments within its territory. If the inherent right to self-government of Aboriginal people were recognized, this would give Native people the ability to develop their own culture, language, and economy, as well as effective control over their own lands, water, and environment. See? The demand for self-government has been rising among Aboriginal Canadians since the early 1980s. And it's a response to the failure of the past Aboriginal policies that aimed at assimilating Native peoples so that they lost their culture, language, and treaty rights. Right? Today, among Aboriginal peoples, self-government is not seen as a gift or a delegation of power by the larger Canadian society, but rather as an inherent right. Many Aboriginal activists see it as the only effective solution to the troubles facing Native Canadians. Self-government is considered to have the potential to restore dignity to those who live and practice it. Alright, so parallelism has, in other words, become the only viable option in the minds of many. So Harold Cardinal's Red Paper or the Hawthorne Report, where there was a common sense of citizenship and a much more middle ground position. These things have fallen by the wayside after they were rejected by the government. People have started to say, you know what, the hell with it then. We're going to the far side of the spectrum. According to many visionaries of the third order of Aboriginal self-government, would have to have the following responsibilities. Each self-governing Aboriginal First Nation would have to draw up a constitution. It would have to set up basic government institutions and establish courts. Each nation would have to lay down its citizenship procedures and run its own schools, maintain its own health and social services, and deal with family matters. Each would regulate its own economic activity. Each would be responsible to foster and protect its own traditional languages, culture, and identity. Each would regulate the use of its own land, water, and resources. Each would levy its own taxes. Each would deal separately with aspects of criminal law and procedure, as well as maintain peace and security in its own territory. The third level of government, namely Aboriginal self-government, would be unlike the first, national, and second, provincial, order of government. Whereas both the national and provincial order governments must not violate the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, this third order of Aboriginal government is not beholden to the Charter. Alright, so anything goes there. For instance, they need not be democratic or recognize the equality rights of women. Right? Maybe they have other traditions, right, that are historically grounded, or they've decided for themselves on other ways of crafting public policy or something like this that wouldn't fly in anywhere else in Canada because they'd violate this or that right. Moreover, whereas provincial governments are all equal constitutionally, third-order Aboriginal governments will not be equal with each other. Some will be more powerful than others. How can self-government be both realistic and helpful to Aboriginal people? Good question. Since 1999, the new territory of Nunavut has offered the Inuit a real opportunity for self-government that has been given neither to status Indians nor to the Métis. The inherited context for the exercise of self-government among status Indians on the reservations, however, is not always favorable. Many Native communities are extremely poor and violent places full of terrible suffering. Reservations are often characterized by their social breakdown, collective trauma, high incidence of sexual and physical abuse, and a depression of spirit resulting from 200 or more years of damage to Aboriginal culture. In these horrendous circumstances, the success of self-government is highly doubtful. Moreover, even if it might be successful on reservations, Aboriginal self-government has only limited application to non-land-based Aboriginals, such as the Métis, and the urban Aboriginal population, which constitutes well over half of the total Aboriginal population. Since the year 2000, 30% of population of Regina, Saskatoon, and Prince Albert has been Aboriginal. Native people sometimes have a difficult time adjusting to city life, and the sad possibility of an Aboriginal underclass and Aboriginal ghettos in Canadian cities cannot be addressed by Aboriginal self-government on reservations. How much can self-government accomplish for Aboriginal Canadians? If a third order of Aboriginal self-government is ever created, it can only be partial and not total in Canada. Self-government cannot mean that Aboriginal people would be unable to seek redress with the federal or provincial governments if their First Nations government doesn't work for them. Aboriginal people must be allowed to participate in the other levels of government as well. Aboriginal people will still live in Canada, so complete independence from the Canadian state would not be possible. Moreover, a third order of Aboriginal self-government would need to have very modest ambitions in order to be realistic, simply because the population of Aboriginal nations is quite small. For instance, the average Aboriginal nation, according to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, has a population of 5,000 to 7,000 people living on the reserve. This means that even the largest Aboriginal First Nation will be dwarfed by even Prince Edward Island, with an equivalent population of 15 to 20 Aboriginal nations. Moreover, about half the Aboriginal population lives off the reservation. Urban Aboriginals will only have very limited opportunities to exercise even modest versions of self-government. So you or I, we're sitting here thinking about this too, right? As educators, what would self-government contribute to education? How would that make for better education? Would it make for better education? How would it be administered? Is it a non-reserve thing? Is it, how does that, what would it look like? Here's a map, again, out of that legacy book that I referred to you, of all the Aboriginal, Inuit, Indian communities in Canada. You can see well scattered across the nation. All right, we've talked really pretty extensively about Bill C-31 in an earlier lecture. I don't want to go back and just go really, really in depth with it again, but I'm going to gloss it here for you. So there's Sandra Lovelace there. She was heavily involved in Bill C-31, bringing this to bear, bringing this to fruition in the Canadian context. What was significant about the 1985 Bill C-31? Well, prior to 1985, any woman who married a non-native man would immediately lose her status as an Indian, along with all the treaty rights that status entailed, such as exemption from taxes, the right to live on a reservation, and any money that's paid to status Indians by the government. In 1985, the Equality Rights section of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into effect. That's Section 15.1, right? This section of the Charter made it unconstitutional to discriminate against Native women. Bill C-31 was written to bring the Indian Act into conformity with the Charter of Rights. It gave back Indian status to women and children with non-status men, husbands, and fathers. One of the problems that arose with Bill C-31 was that because there were now so many more people who qualified as Indian or status Indians, there wasn't enough housing on reservations for them. Right? So they brought in the bill, in other words, but then they didn't bring in the money and the funding and the supports to allow the bill to, actually live in the reality of, the lives of Native people. For this reason, a lot of status Indians must live off of the reservation, even if they'd like to return. Interestingly, the Assembly of First Nations, or the AFN, opposed Bill C-31, as well as the idea that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms ought to apply to Aboriginal self-government. For this reason, many Native women are suspicious of the drive for self-government in Aboriginal policy. All right, moving along. The 1992 Charlottetown Accord. There's a picture there of Elijah Harper. Now, we don't really associate him so much with the Charlottetown Accord. Really, when he was a really big national figure, was during Meech Lake in 1987. But I've said that he's an important figure here. Well, why? Well, the 1987 Meech Lake Accord would have recognized Quebec as a, quote, distinct society, and was strongly founded upon the two nations theory of Canada, as having its roots in English and French-speaking peoples. So this two nations theory obviously didn't recognize Native people as the founding people, right? So, three nations. Anyway, this was not acceptable to many First Nations people. They also felt that, like, when all these talks were going on, they weren't being included. It was all the first ministers and the prime minister and everybody meeting, but they were shut out of the process, right? They didn't feel that was very good. So Manitoba MLA Elijah Harper, he took a principled stance against Meech Lake. And this eagle feather of his was very famous, right? He held up the eagle feather when the votes were going on, and they needed unanimous consent in the Manitoba legislature, which they didn't get. And because of this, then the bill failed, or the Meech Lake Accord wasn't passed. So his opposition to the bill, stuck with Mulrooney, Prime Minister Mulrooney at the time. So then when Mulrooney brought in the second accord in 1991, the Charlottetown Accord, there was a lot more attention to the needs and concerns of Aboriginal people in that accord. And you'll see on the spectrum that Charlottetown Accord's provisions for Aboriginal people, again, move further to the parallelism side of the spectrum. So what would the 1992 Charlottetown Accord have offered Canada's Native peoples had it been ratified? Well, the Charlottetown Accord, had it not been rejected in the national referendum, would have granted the following to Aboriginal Canadians. Number one, the inherent right to self-government would have been recognized. Number two, the Métis would have been recognized officially as an Aboriginal group in Section 91 of the Constitution, that would have been put in there as well. Number three, the Accord would have offered Aboriginal people more direct say in Canadian government through nation-to-nation bargaining at FMCs, or First Ministers' conferences. Number four, a third order of Aboriginal government would have been established. All right. Number five, there would have been guaranteed special separate seats in Parliament that no other racial group could occupy. In other words, this is really significant. Seats in Parliament dedicated to Native people who would sit there. And it was a racially based seat. All right. Number six, a double majority would be demanded in the Senate for any Aboriginal issues. In other words, the rest of Canada all, maybe make a big law, right? But if the law had anything to do with Native people, you'd need a double majority. You'd need the Aboriginal senators on side with it. They would have had a veto power over any law that affected Native people. Now, does that just mean a law that has somewhere in the title of it, Aboriginal Canadians, or does that mean healthcare? Because healthcare affects Native people, right? Or anything to do with say, I don't know, like any health policy, any education policy, anything social policy, maybe a policy on in the criminal code or something like that. Does that mean that you would have a veto power over anything that might affect Aboriginal people? I mean, laws affect everybody in Canada. So this is a really powerful a powerful idea here. Number 7, Aboriginal people would have been given a role in the selection of Supreme Court judges. All right, so it wouldn't have just been the Prime Minister. It wouldn't have just been his cronies. And the selection process. No, Aboriginal people would have been allowed to submit candidates as well. Number 8, Aboriginal consent on constitutional issues affecting Aboriginals would have been always demanded in the future. And number 9, Aboriginal politics and the third order of government would be exempt from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Sorry, Native Women's Association of Canada. This is what would have happened, right? And number 10, the Accord promised that there would be 4 more First Ministers' conferences on Aboriginal issues. So, really, I mean, a lot of notice given here and consideration given here to First Nations peoples. Like, just black and white when you compare it to the white paper, right? The white paper was just like, no consideration. Everybody's equal. Shut up and, assimilate. This is just like, let's as much as possible separate Native people from the rest of Canada. Let's as much as possible put in place, almost like a treaty federalist vision of Canada. Like, can you imagine what some of these things would have done, how they would have affected the government of Canada? It would have been very, very different country today. Anyway, Native Canadians rejected the Accord, even though the Aboriginal leaders supported it. Like Ovid Murkerty there, totally supported it. But initially, the Assembly of First Nations opposed the Charlottetown Accord. Later, they came to support it, judging it was good for Aboriginal Canadians. However, despite the fact that self-government package in the Accord was embraced by the AFN and publicly endorsed by Ovid Mercredi, the Grand Chief at the time, the majority of First Nations people rejected the package and the Accord. This occurred when the provisions of the Charlottetown Accord were put to First Nations people by way of referendum, which was recorded and counted separately from the non-Aboriginal vote. I guess just to see, what their thoughts were on it. The loss had to be seen as a significant failure for Ovid Mercredi and the Aboriginal leaders who had taken the Charlottetown Accord to the Aboriginal people for their support, claiming they had managed to advance First Nations agenda into meaningful constitutional change. Well, they sure did. Anyway, Aboriginal Canadians rejected the leadership of their elites, just as Canadians at large rejected the leadership of their governing parties. So, perhaps Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians aren't so different after all, right? We all thought the Charlottetown Accord was worth rejecting. All right, that's 1991, and now we're going to look at the 1996 Royal Commission, the RCAP Report. What were the recommendations of the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples? Well, the 1996 RCAP report was the most expensive Royal Commission report in Canadian history. The final report spans some 4,000 pages of documentation, and it looks at the history of terrible abuse that Native people have suffered in Canada. It examines possible ways in which Aboriginal peoples can be helped to live better, more happy lives in Canada, and how they might overcome some of the terrible problems that have arisen in their communities, in large part due to past abuses and failed government policy on Native peoples. So what was it all about? Well, the Commission stresses the importance of Native territory to the improvement of life for Aboriginal people in Canada. It views the possession of Native territory as key to their cultural survival. However, the flip side of this fixation on territory is that the RCAP systematically overlooks urban Aboriginals who have chosen to leave Native territory and reservations to be assimilated in the larger society of Canadian cities instead. So, again, on this spectrum arrow that I've drawn here for you, the RCAP report really swings, far over to the parallelism side of the spectrum. The report acts as a kind of truth commission. It gives detailed first-hand accounts of the horrible abuse that Native people have suffered historically in residential schools, as well as how poverty, substance abuse, discrimination, and violence have affected Native people in the long term. So there's a little map showing you where all these residential schools were located throughout Canada. The report divides Native history into 4 periods. First, the pre-contact setting of separate worlds. We talked a lot about this, actually, didn't we? When we discussed the treaties, we went through the history of contact and different deals and bargains struck and surrender documents and those sorts of things. So the first section, the first period was separate worlds. The second period, contact and cooperation. The third period, displacement and assimilation. And the fourth period is the current period of negotiation and renewal. So the point of this 4-point history, or 4-part history, is to produce a fairer, less one-sided version of history. That's what the RCAP report wanted to do. Let their voice be heard on, this history of what's happened to Native people in Canada. So the RCAP report was written as a forum for Aboriginal voices. Aboriginal people have been ignored for a long time, yes indeed, and the report was meant to record their stories so that the larger Canadian society would become educated about just what had happened to Aboriginal people throughout history. It's hoped that Canadians will begin to understand better some of the challenges faced by Aboriginal people, and that the report will help reduce racism and discrimination against Aboriginal people. That's why it's good, folks. I mean, these lectures of mine are long and maybe irritating because of their length, but really I hope that they're of some value to you, because that's what your job, that's your power as a teacher, folks, is to build understanding, and through understanding help reduce racism and discrimination against Native people in Canada, right? The RCAP wants to create a nation-to-nation relationship between the Aboriginal First Nations of Canada and the nation of Canada. There's that word nation being used in so many different ways, isn't it? Each Aboriginal nation would be entitled to self-government. There would be roughly 80 Aboriginal nations that Canada would have to deal with as separate countries. This vision of Canada makes it very hard to think about a common Canadian citizenship that binds us all together. It also privileges governments over citizens. The feelings and thoughts of individual Aboriginal people, whether or not they feel Canadian, don't matter as much as their ideas of their representative native governments. So, the report likes the organizational structure of federalism in Canada. However, it would like to move away from a provincial federalism towards a multinational federalism. It would like to see federalism include a third order of government instead of simply provincial and national governments. The report sees the government-to-government relations between provinces and the national government are similar to nation-to-nation relations. So this is that treaty federalism stuff that we talked about in the first lecture, right? Or rather, the second lecture. I don't know, I'm losing track. Federalism also protects diversity, and so it could protect the diversity of Aboriginal peoples as well. Finally, if Aboriginal peoples became self-governing in a federal system, they'd also be entitled to receive huge sums of money through equalization payments in the Canadian federal system. Just like equalization moves money from this province, a have province, to a have-not province. If the native governments became a third order of government in a kind of a federal relation, nation to nation, in an or a multinational federal system, they would get money, right? Because they'd be have-nots. Clearly, they'd be have-nots, and they would receive money from the rest of Canada that way. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People would like to see the creation of an Aboriginal House of First Peoples. Right? So whereas we have a Canadian Parliament and it's divided in, bicameral, right? House of Commons, House of the Senate. The Aboriginal House of First Peoples would be a third separate body of Native politicians that would sit apart from the other two houses. And it would deal with Native issues in Canada. And any national policy in Canada that affected Native peoples would require support from the Aboriginal House. So, again, very different. Now, in this election right now, the big thing is like, well, let's abolish the Senate. Let's just not even have bicameral. Let's have one house. Well, under this vision, you'd have actually three houses of government. And, another question one would have is, this Aboriginal House of First Peoples, of course, Native people are affected by all the laws. Every Canadian is affected by all the laws. So wouldn't they have a veto over every single law that ever was made in Canada about anything, right? So what are some of the problems with the RCAP report? Well, the Royal Commission's vision of Canada in the report lacks any sense of common citizenship. So again, it's way, way over on the parallelism side of the spectrum. No sense of common citizenship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. It recommends that the difficulties faced by Aboriginal peoples be solved by turning Canada into a mini international system in which each Aboriginal nation would bargain with the rest of the nation of Canada on equal terms. So, the rest of Canada is on equal terms with, like some little nation of 5,000 people on a reserve somewhere. Aboriginal citizenship in Canada would be more like multinational citizenship, like having citizenship both in China and Canada at the same time. The Canadian government system involves a lot of bargaining between the 10 provincial premiers and the Prime Minister. This happens most often at First Ministers' conferences, although under Stephen Harper we haven't had First Ministers' conferences where he's willing to go, but that was typically traditionally how things were done, and it's called executive federalism. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report recommends that each Aboriginal nation be represented at these meetings whenever the subject of the meeting might affect Native people. However, executive federalism won't work with 60 to 80 new delegates. Aboriginal nations would have to simplify the representation at these meetings somehow, right? So, maybe some, like back when this was going on, Ovid Murcredy, maybe, he would come to the FMCs or something like that, or, that might be a good compromise position. The RCAP recommends that Aboriginal people be granted self-government in Canada. However, the population of the Aboriginal First Nations is very small, so this third order of government would only have limited capacity. The suggestions are that this third order of government ought to relate to the rest of Canada by treaty rather than by common citizenship, and this is unworkable because Aboriginal people are not self-sufficient. They're not able to operate as nations independent of the rest of Canada. Moreover, this third order of government will rely heavily on money external to Aboriginal nations. Will Canadians be willing to give huge amounts of equalization payments to this third order of government when it serves to weaken the ties of citizenship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians? I think that's a really important point when you're thinking about Aboriginal policy, right? And when you're thinking about education too. Canada's our country. Canada, one of the things we're doing besides teaching the reading, writing, and arithmetic is a common sense of care and concern for each other, right? We're all in this together. We should care about each other. We're all citizens. But when you weaken the ties of citizenship, what we all hold together in common, we become more and more selfish, more and more insulated from one another, isolated from one another, right? I think that this has happened generally in Canada, that people, unfortunately, have become more and more ugly towards their neighbor and less willing to pay taxes, or think about, other people who maybe need services that you don't need because you're healthy or because, you don't have their problems or whatever. So what about that? If how would this parallelism theory, if enacted, affect our attitudes towards one another, our ability, our willingness to help one another and to stand by one another? Whereas provincial governments are all equal constitutionally, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal report suggests that these third-order Aboriginal governments will not all be equal with each other. Some nations are much bigger and wealthier than others. Also, because Aboriginals will take on traditional or customary Indigenous forms, they need not be democratic governments, nor must they respect the rights and freedoms that are protected under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Unlike the rest of the Canadian society, Aboriginal nations will not be open societies. Whereas anyone in Canada is allowed to enter and participate in any part of Canadian society, participation in Aboriginal societies is only open to Aboriginal people. Moreover, belonging to one of the First Nations will not necessarily mean acceptance in another First Nation. This form of closed citizenship among all the different Aboriginal First Nations will hamper notions of common Canadian citizenship, or common citizenship between Aboriginal nations even. Right, so there's lots and lots of problems here, folks. And the Royal Commission report would like to see a return to the Two-Row Wampum Treaty model, of relations between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Canada. However, this two-row wampum model is no longer realistic, is it? Things have changed far too much. First, at the time of the two-row wampum treaty, the non-Aboriginal population was very small in North America, but now it's overwhelming. And the Aboriginal population, by contrast, is very small. It doesn't make sense to treat the two populations as equals anymore. Second, the power of each group is very much different now, whereas at the time of the treaty, the Native peoples had great power across North America. Now North America is organized into countries in which power is organized quite differently, and Native people no longer have great power. Third, even Native people have changed in their relations to one another. They're closely knit together now, and no longer separated from one another by tribal warfare anymore. And finally, Canada is a country now. It's not an international system, and it would be unrealistic to treat it as such, like the RCAP recommends. So the RCAP report is actually very weak in its analysis of the representation of Aboriginal people in Canadian politics. The RCAP report distrusts normal majoritarian politics, like democratic politics, right, in which the majority vote wins in Canada, because historically, the particular concerns of Aboriginal people haven't been a priority among politicians. Not just historically, but currently, right? Politicians must listen to what the majority of voters want. Aboriginal people make up only a very small part of the vote. This Aboriginal distrust of politics has led to a weak sense of common citizenship. Moreover, Aboriginal people feel isolated from the majority of Canadians. Additionally, it's led to a preference for law over politics. Most of the great big gains and victories that Native people have had in Canadian politics haven't come through political change. The 1960 right to vote was a great, significant event, but really, most of the victories have been in the courts, folks. And if we had more time, and if you had more patience with me, I would give you a whole lecture on the big, significant court cases in Aboriginal litigation and constitutional matters and treaties and these sorts of things. It's very interesting. But you can see that is the place where Native people have found the most congenial ear to their problems and the suffering that they've had to endure. Because of the historical abuses of Native people in politics, Aboriginal people have begun to look to laws and rights legislation to protect them against the whims of voting majorities. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples suggests that Aboriginal people should be insulated by law from the ups and downs of democratic policies or politics, just as other minorities are protected from the tyranny of majorities using rights legislation. Moreover, Aboriginal people or Aboriginal representation in politics by ordinary means is not acceptable according to the RCAP. It would like to see, quote, nation-to-nation politics, in which Aboriginal nations bargain with the nation of Canada as its equal. It would create an Aboriginal House of First Peoples as the only arena in which Native people would vote. Voting in regular elections, like the rest of Canadian society, is discouraged because it involves participation in the majoritarian political process, right? So this is, anti-colonialism, right? Well, you're calling, when you vote like a regular Canadian citizen, you're almost like an Uncle Tom, right? You're almost someone who has bought into your master, or all the power structures that have for centuries kept you down and kept you powerless. The RCAP report overlooks the representation of Aboriginal people at the provincial level altogether. The role of Native women in politics is overlooked by the RCAP report. Native women distrust the idea of the RCAP concerning self-government because Native government bodies are dominated by men. and there are extremely high rates of sexual and physical abuse among Native women by Aboriginal men. Many Native women are worried they will be shut out of power in Aboriginal self-government. Aboriginal self-government is thought to be exempt from the rights protections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms on the basis that Native governments may take traditional, customary forms in which women are not allowed to vote or not allowed to lead. Self-government need not, in fact, be democratic at all. Many Native women, already worried about the light sentences that sex offenders have in healing circles, are worried that self-government would create further inequalities for women on reservations. So a lot of these RCAP recommendations have certain problems to them, folks. And it overlooks how Native people will be represented politically off reservation land. Over half of the Aboriginal population doesn't live on reservations. Canadian citizenship only seems to be important in the RCAP report where self-government is not possible. As in the case of, the reserves in the cities. So, the report largely overlooks how important getting the vote in 1960 was for Native Canadians in giving them a voice in politics. Perhaps this is because of the Commission's distrust of majoritarian politics. The Royal Commission wants all provincial services to be paid for not by Native individuals but by First Nation government. This measure is supposed to weaken the identity of Canadian citizens of Native Canadians with federal and provincial governments and strengthen the relationship with Aboriginal governments. So in other words, whenever you get a government service, you as a non-Native person, it's either stamped with, the province of Alberta or the province of Ontario or whatever, or it's stamped with, the government of Canada on it. And so that builds your allegiances. So the RCAP is saying, well, we want our allegiances to be primarily with our First Nations groups. So we don't want you guys taking the credit. We don't want you administrating these programs. We want to administrate them ourselves, and then we will take credit for them. The RCAP report recommends that the third level of Aboriginal self-government receive equalization payments without ties of citizenship. The bonds of fraternity or citizenship between Canadians are the basis for equalization. We give to other people in Canada who are in need because we're all Canadian. However, without an idea of common citizenship, if Aboriginal policy effectively divorces Native people from the rights and responsibilities shared by all other Canadians, equalization payments to Aboriginal people will not have any basis in fellow feeling. They'll not be acceptable to the larger Canadian population. A large part of the problems faced by Aboriginal people in Canada is the result of indifference and neglect by the majority of Canadian society towards Native people, and the isolation of Native people from the rest of Canada. However, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People report would separate Native people from the rest of Canadian society even more. It would break the ties of citizenship such that Canadian society would have even less motivation to care about what happens on reserves. Okay, and I guess the final thing I'd like to say here is that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People report is only interested in federalism for its decentralizing effect, not for its ability to bring people together. The importance of citizenship, or what all Canadians have in common, is entirely overlooked by the report. Alright, so that's why it's way on the extreme of parallelism, folks. The RCAP wants the perks of federalism without the shared discussions of federalism. The Commission only looks to federalism to protect diversity. It's not interested in the creation of commonality, as were the Fathers of Confederation. Alright? So we're going to move along here to the 2004-2005 Kelowna Accord then. This accord was brought in by Paul Martin under the old Liberal government, but then it went nowhere because Stephen Harper's government came along and refused to ratify it, and it kind of went down the toilet. See what it is. Well, the Kelowna Accord, announced in November 2005, was the result of an 18-month consultative process that involved the federal government, provincial and territorial governments, and 5 national Aboriginal organizations. In order to close the gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal standards of living in Canada, the Accord was a 10-year plan including a $5 billion commitment over 5 years aimed at significantly improving health, education, housing, infrastructure, economic opportunities, the whole gamut, all right? The Accord was endorsed by Paul Martin, but was never endorsed by Stephen Harper. Who was involved? Well, it took its name from Kelowna, BC, where the meeting of First Ministers took place in 2005. The goals and commitments outlined in the Accord were established over an 18-month period, beginning with the Canada or Aboriginal Peoples Roundtable in 2004. Numerous other small meetings, ending with the First Ministers meeting in 2005. Overall, about 1,000 people were invited to participate in the process, with representatives from federal governments, provincial and territorial governments, 5 national Aboriginal organizations. I think that's one thing that, maybe, I mean, I'm of no political stripe at all, but I think that's one thing that maybe, under Martin's leadership, people, I don't know, and before him really too, but was done better. There was more consultation, it seems like more stakeholders were allowed to speak, and more people had the ear of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister didn't have all the say in everything, and it wasn't so centralized as it has been since this time. And maybe that has caused certain tensions to escalate in Aboriginal policy making since the Kelowna Accord was trashed. The motivation for these meetings was the glaring gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians in terms of health, education, housing, economic opportunity. At the time, infant mortality in Aboriginal communities was almost 20% higher than in the general Canadian population. Moreover, Aboriginal people were 3 times more likely to have type 2 diabetes, and suicide rates were 3 to 11 times higher than in non-Aboriginal populations. Thus, the stated goals of the Kelowna Accord included reducing infant mortality, youth suicide, early childhood obesity, diabetes by 20% in 5 years, and by 50% in 10 years. So they had these, this was their action plan, right? With the federal government allocating over $1.3 billion for health services. The data was also sobering in terms of education. In 2001, around 44% of Aboriginal people hadn't graduated from high school, compared to 19% for non-Aboriginals. All right? Shocking stuff. One of the Kelowna Accord's targets was therefore to raise high school graduation rates to the average Canadian rate by 2016. Well, it's not long before 2016 right now, folks, with around $1.8 billion of federal funds committed to this end. So this was a big investment in education, right? As unemployment was significantly higher in Aboriginal compared to non-Aboriginal populations, the Accord dedicated $200 million to developing economic opportunities. And another $1.6 billion was earmarked for housing and infrastructure. And $170 million was allocated for, these are big ticket items here, folks. Lots of ideas. We have to help. And the Kelowna Accord was all about trying to reduce this gap in all these different areas, right? So here I've just highlighted in red the investments here, like billions and billions of dollars for all different social and educational services for Native people. but it was rejected, right? Harper's Conservative government dropped it, and I'm sure that has a fair bit to do with the pretty negative attitudes towards the Conservative government since that time among Aboriginal organizations, right? So here we have the 2006 Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. This is an important milestone in Canadian Aboriginal policy. The Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, or the IRSSA, was a Canadian federal court-approved Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement announced by the Canadian federal government on May 8th, 2006, with implementation in 2007. The IRSSA recognized the damage inflicted by Indian residential schools and established a $2 billion compensation package for the approximately 86,000 people who were forced to attend these schools. The IRSSA was the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. By December 2012, a total of $1.62 billion was paid to a little over 78,000 former students, which represents 98% of the 80,000 who were eligible. The IRSSA was a combination of a common experience payment, which was on average about $28,000, an independent assessment process, and commemoration activities. The IRSSA was parceled together with the government's 2008 public apology, which we'll look at in a minute, in addition to the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These initiatives are collectively designed to establish new relations between Aboriginal people and other Canadians, relations based on a knowledge of history, a respect for each other, and a desire to move forward together with a renewed understanding. It's understood that acceptance of the common experience payment releases government and churches from all further liability, right? So if you take this money, compensation package, then you can't pursue the government or the churches any further, except if you were, sexually abused or seriously physically abused in some fashion. All right, the federal government apology, Harper's apology, I was actually going to play the substance of that for you, but I think that it's easy enough for you just to go to YouTube and you can listen to the speech. The speech, as you can see here, is very short. It's only 2 pages long. But if you listen to it on YouTube, it's powerful to listen to. But it's actually about it's a little over 10 minutes long because it's done in both French and English, in both official languages, right? So it's worthwhile reading through that document. There it is there for you if you want to pause it. It was a meaningful event for many people, although, I don't know, it seems that, many people, it kind of rang hollow with them too. It left people dissatisfied, even though it's important to say sorry. It also left many, many people dissatisfied and kind of wondering, even as to the sincerity of the apology. You can see, even in these political cartoons here, how Prime Minister Harper's being lampooned or criticized for lacking any sincerity in his apologizing, because if you apologize but then you continue along the road of not recognizing the needs of Native people on reserves, or if you go to the G20 and you say Canada doesn't have a history of colonialism, or if you shut out people from seeing you, you refuse to meet with anybody. These things make people wonder if the apology was hollow in some way, I mean, not everybody feels that way, but some folks feel that way. Okay, we're almost done. I'd like to look briefly with you at the 2012 Idle No More protest movement. These folks are still in existence, still prominent on the Native rights scene, but their movement began in 2012. Idle No More is an ongoing protest movement founded by 4 women. It's a grassroots movement among the Aboriginal peoples in Canada, comprising the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and their non-Aboriginal supporters in Canada, and to a lesser extent internationally. It's consisted of a number of political actions worldwide, inspired in part by the liquid diet hunger strike of Attawapiskat Chief Teresa Spence, and further coordinated via social media. A reaction to alleged abuses of Indigenous treaty rights by Stephen Harper's Conservative federal government. The movement takes particular issue with the federal omnibus bill, C-45. Not just Aboriginal people had a problem with Bill C-45. Many people had a problem with Bill C-45. But, majority governments can do what majority governments do, so the popular movement has included round dances in public places and blockades of rail lines. So there's an Idle No More protest. You can see the separatist Mohawk Nation flag flying there. This is the manifesto of the Idle No More movement. I just took it right off of their website, and as I read it to you, think about where this group falls on the spectrum. The treaties are nation-to-nation agreements between First Nations and the British Crown, who are sovereign nations. Sovereign nations. The treaties are agreements that cannot be altered or broken by one side of the 2 nations. The spirit and intent of the treaty agreements meant that First Nations peoples would share the land but retain their inherent rights to land and resources. Instead, First Nations have experienced a history of colonization, which has resulted in outstanding land claims, lack of resources, and unequal funding for services such as education and housing. The state of Canada has become one of the wealthiest countries in the world by using the land and resources. Canadian mining, logging, oil, and fishing companies are the most powerful in the world due to land and resources. Some of the poorest nations, First Nations communities such as Attawapiskat, have mines or other developments on their land but do not get a share of the profit. The taking of resources has left many lands and waters poisoned. The animals and plants are dying in many areas of Canada. We cannot live without land and water. We have laws older than this colonial government about how to live with the land, right? So that's an important item here. We have laws older than this colonial government about how to live with the land. Currently, this government is trying to pass many laws so that reserve lands can also be bought and sold by big companies. They're promising to share this time. Why would these promises be different from past promises? We'll be left with nothing but poisoned water, land, and air. This is an attempt to take away sovereignty and the inherent right to land and resources from First Nation people. There are many examples of other countries moving towards sustainability, and we must demand sustainable development as well. Does sustainable development and sustainability mean the same thing as treaty federalism? We believe in healthy, just, equitable, and sustainable communities, and we have a vision and plan of how to build them. So, you can decide for yourself where along that line Idle No More fits. I wonder what has happened to the climate of public discourse. It's gotten very ugly. People are being shouted down on both sides. You can see just even in these 2 political cartoons how you can't necessarily say there's a black and white, good and bad, black hat, white hat kind of a scenario going on here. That as far as public discourse goes, in a democracy where we discuss things openly, Idle No More also may have certain problems in the way that it goes about dealing with its concerns and issues and this sort of thing. So you could have a really good discussion about that in your classes. One of the last things I want to talk with you about is Bill C-33, this 2014 bill. It was entitled First Nations Control of First Nations Education. This bill would have pumped in an awful lot of money into education, folks, for Native people. And Sean Atleo was the national chief of the AFN for during the time that this was being hammered out, and he was trying to work in an intermediate position between the First Nations and the federal government. He was a good go-between, I think, and he was trying to struck a deal, but certain factions, very extreme factions on the parallelist side of the spectrum, lambasted him and gave him no end of criticism as being some kind of a sellout or an Uncle Tom, to white colonial power, and he resigned. And so this deal that could have really benefited Native people was just dissolved. Let's look at it briefly. There's Sean Atleo there. You can find archived newspaper footage or news headlines on this debacle. But he resigned in 2014, last year. Well, what would the bill have offered to First Nations people to reform education? $1.9 billion in funding for Aboriginal education starting in 2015. $1.25 billion over 3 years for Aboriginal schools across Canada beginning in 2016. An amount that Prime Minister Harper pledged would increase by 4.5% each year after. An additional $160 million for an implementation fund and $500 million for new infrastructure on reserves over 7 years was also expected to start. The proposed legislation promised to give First Nations control of their education system and enabled the incorporation of language and culture programming in the curriculum. It would repeal the provisions of the Indian Act related to residential schools, which is largely a symbolic gesture that follows the apology made by Harper in 2008. The new legislation would require teachers on reserves to acquire provincial certification and include measures to improve attendance records and low graduation rates. I know people who are subs on the First Nations schools, and they don't have teacher certification. They have, they're smart people and they're good people, but they don't have provincial certification. So this would have ended that practice, right? The plan calls for minimum education standards consistent with provincial standards off reserve. All right, and this is the idea of reform, folks, and allows the establishment of First Nations education authorities that will act like school boards in the provincial education system. All right, so it would have created kind of overseeing bodies, First Nation education authorities that would act like school boards and make sure that people are meeting standards. The court document shows the draft bill was amended to require that elders, parents, and students be meaningfully involved in the decision-making processes in their community's education as well. So, all those things, do they sound reasonable to you? Talk about that among yourselves. But, these were the ideas that were brought forth. Almost $2 billion in funding, the idea here is to reform education to transform outcomes. Anyway, it was rejected. The Assembly of First Nations opposed the blueprint for the Act, saying it doesn't affirm First Nation control over Aboriginal education, among other issues. Also, the leaders said that the legislation would allow large education authorities to dictate what kids are learning and how funding is spent. Well, it's like that everywhere else, right? I mean, we have departments of education, we have school boards, we have overseeing bodies to make sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, that's part of education reform, isn't it? But I guess that was unacceptable. So the AFN, they had this resolution back in 2013, 5 basic criteria that they wanted to be met, right? And these are them here in blue. I've highlighted them, however, like simplified them for you. Basically, it's just First Nations control of education was the first one. Guaranteed federal funding. Protection of language and culture. Joint oversight of the new education system. And meaningful consultation with Aboriginals. So, I mean, some questions that you could ask. You know, how far off was Bill C-33? I mean, doesn't it sound to you? I mean, maybe it doesn't. To me, it sounds like it did all those things, didn't it? What do you think caused the bill to be rejected? What kind of a bill would strike the best balance among Aboriginal, or along the Aboriginal policy spectrum we've been discussing? Like, what would good Aboriginal education policy look like if it were somewhere in the middle? Would a balanced education reform bill find favor in today's climate among Aboriginal groups? You know, maybe they'd say, oh, well, it smacks too much of colonialism, or, you know, if not, what can be done, right? Like, if the climate is so poisoned that every bill that you know, the only possibility for a bill to get passed is if it is on the absolute one extreme end of the Aboriginal policy making spectrum, what kind of education is afforded there? And another question is, how is it possible to reform Aboriginal education, right? If, you know, something that seems reasonable is held in contempt, well, what are you going to do? Like, how could it possibly change? These are big frustrations in education right now. Okay, and then the last thing I want to talk with you about really is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Its findings just came out. It's a huge document that they have. I'm not going to go through the whole document. I just pulled out the aspects related to education. So these are the recommendations, right? Under education, they call upon the government to repeal Section 43 of the Criminal Code of Canada. That's the section we've already talked about in one of our litigation lectures. That's the corporal punishment side, where, you know, it's the part where teachers are allowed to use a certain amount of force in a classroom situation. All right, so they want that repealed. We call upon the federal government to develop with Aboriginal groups a joint strategy to eliminate educational and employment gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. They want to eliminate the discrepancy in federal education funding for First Nations. All right, so, like, you know, are all Aboriginal schools funded equitably? And not only that, but, like, okay, well, provincial governments fund public education at a certain level. Well, is the federal government funding at the same level? Or are, you know, Native schools not being funded adequately? Are they not being funded on par with, non-Native schools? Right? So this is a big problem. We call upon the federal government to eliminate the discrepancy in federal education funding. Number 9, we call upon governments to publish annual reports comparing funding for education of First Nation children on and off reserves. Number 10, we call on federal government to draft new Aboriginal education legislation with the full participation and informed consent of Aboriginal people. New legislation would include a commitment to sufficient funding and would incorporate the principles of providing sufficient funding to close identified educational achievement gaps, right? And also improving education attainment levels and success rates. And then developing culturally appropriate curriculum. Protecting the right of Aboriginal languages, including the teaching of Aboriginal languages as credit courses, and enabling parental and community responsibility control and accountability similar to what parents enjoy in public schools, and enabling parents to participate in the education of their children and respecting and honoring treaty relationships, right? We call upon the federal government to provide adequate funding to end the backlog of First Nations students seeking a post-secondary education. Call upon them to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Aboriginal families. And then in another section called Education and Reconciliation, more recommendations here, right? They want people to make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal people's historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, a mandatory education requirement. Now, in actual fact, I mean, I don't know how carefully they really studied. I mean, obviously it's a big document. They must have had people look at this. But if you look at the Alberta curriculum, it is full. It is replete with Aboriginal, First Nations, Métis, Inuit content. Lots and lots and lots. It's mandated in there. Every grade there is tons. Okay, so not a problem here in Alberta anyway. Provide the necessary funding to post-secondary institutions to educate teachers on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods into the classroom. Provide necessary funding to Aboriginal schools to utilize Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in the classroom. I mean, essentially, more PDs devoted to how to teach Native students, or how to teach content to do with Native students, or not just Native students but Native people in Canada, right? To break down barriers of ignorance, in other words. Problem is, I mean, education is being axed and slashed by governments. Nobody wants to invest the amount of money that it requires and that's needed in order to have good PD, and not just on Aboriginal issues, but on any issues. Like, there's all kinds of other, people who send their kids to school, disabled people from other parts of the world, ELL kids, high needs kids, gifted kids. In other words, there are so many different things that are important to do on a PD, and there's just not enough money going around. So the Aboriginal voice is just one of many, 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 many voices in education here. We call upon Council 63. We call upon the Council of Ministers of Education to maintain commitments to Aboriginal education, including developing kindergarten curriculums to grade 12, sharing information and best practices on teaching curriculum, building student capacity for intercultural understanding, identifying teacher training needs relating to the above, right? We call upon all levels of government that provide funds to denominational schools to require such schools to provide something on comparative religious studies, which must include Aboriginal spiritual beliefs, right? Yes, I mean, okay, this is another thing. When you teach comparative religions, typically, okay, you're going to do Christianity, you're going to do Judaism, Islam, you're going to do Hinduism and Buddhism, and then from there, you're going to, more and more voices are going, want to have, their particular religious tradition represented in the curriculum. And so Native people and Native spiritualities are one among these many voices too. Aboriginal spiritual beliefs and practices developed in collaboration with Aboriginal elders. 65, we call upon the federal government through the Social Sciences and Humanities, the SSHRC Council, and in collaboration with Aboriginal Peoples, post-secondary institutions, to establish a national research program. So there's lots and lots of recommendations here, and they're all good, folks, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And we do well to consider them. It's important for us to know about these things. So what are we doing as teachers? Well, I think that we're doing a heck of a lot. When I look at that spectrum, and when I look at the spectrum of Aboriginal policy in Canada, and I see how it moves from one extreme to the other extreme, and it doesn't seem like middle ground is possible, because people's pain and suffering and inhospitality, or intolerance or ignorance towards each other gets in the way of a middle ground. It seems like it's almost like despair. But we have this wonderful ability as teachers to teach, and I think that any real change is going to come from us and through us. We are the people who get all the kids, not just the First Nations kids, but all the kids, non-native, native, and we will help them build understanding of one another. And the curriculums that we deliver will help build this understanding. So here's an example of the BC government, right? You have a 2008 package. At the grade 12 level, you can take academic English, you can take non-academic English. You can also take, and you don't have to be First Nations to take it either, you can take grade 12 First Peoples strand. And so this is interesting because obviously it's tailored for people who are from First Nations, but it works really well for people who aren't too. So the readings are different, right? It's not just the old dead guys canon, right, from Europe. It's there's a lot more First Nations stories, First Nations authors, but also too there's oral storytelling involved in it. There's a lot more different sorts of ways into learning that not just First Nations people, but kids who are better at auditory learning, or better visual learners, or that are more kinesthetic learners. These things are taken more into account in the First Peoples curriculum, so it could benefit all kinds of folks. That's a good example. And I can speak better to the program of studies for social studies here in Alberta. Like, if you look at the front matter to the Alberta Social Studies curriculum, I've highlighted specific selections here from the front matter, but it's just replete with Aboriginal content, right? Everywhere through each grade, teachers are required to ensure that they are touching on First Nations issues, Aboriginal issues, Inuit, Métis issues, right? That these things are integrated throughout the whole curriculum. It's woven right through. And that's not just in the front matter. If you actually look through the general outcomes and the specific outcomes throughout each one of the grades, you'll see where these things are linked specifically into what you teach in the classroom. So there's lots and lots and lots of opportunity as a teacher to start building understanding and breaking down walls of ignorance. All right, I would say that is our primary target as teachers, right? Is to target ignorance, right? All right, well, that's it for today, folks. Thanks. That was a long bit of patience that I got from you. I hope that this has helped inform your understanding of Aboriginal issues, and it's made you think a little bit about what we can do as teachers, given this long history of relations between Native and non-Native people in Canada, how we can help make positive change as teachers in the things that we do in our own classrooms. Thanks for listening.